There are two naval wars that seem to dominate World War II conversations. The Atlantic, where the Grey Wolves stalked the North Sea routes and tried to starve Britain into submission, and the Pacific, where American carrier task forces and island-hopping campaigns turned the tide against Japan. But there was a third war, one that has been largely erased from popular memory. It was fought across 3.5 million square miles of open water. It involved German U-boats, Japanese submarines, disguised merchant raiders, carrier task forces, and some of the most desperate convoy battles of the entire conflict. It threatened to sever the supply lines feeding the entire Allied war effort in North Africa, the Middle East, India, and the Soviet Union. It was the Indian Ocean Convoy War, and almost no one talks about it. To understand why this theater mattered so profoundly, you have to understand what the Indian Ocean actually connected. Before the war, the Indian Ocean was the circulatory system of the British Empire. Oil from the Persian Gulf and even tea from Ceylon. Troops and supplies flowing from India to East Africa, from Australia to the Middle East. The lifeline of the entire British imperial machine ran through this water. When you look at a map of World War II, the standard narrative focuses on the North Atlantic convoy routes, the Pacific Island campaigns. But there was a continuous chain of shipping stretching from Cape Town up the East African coast, around the Gulf of Aden, into the Red Sea, over to the Persian Gulf, across to India, and onward to Australia, and every link in that chain was a target. The moment war came, the Axis understood the value of that chain, and they moved immediately to break it. The Indian Ocean's War began in 1939. Germany deployed its first weapon almost immediately. Not submarines, something more sinister, disguised commerce raiders. These were ordinary-looking merchant vessels, secretly converted into heavily armed warships. They flew false flags, changed their silhouettes with fake funnels and painted markings, and moved freely through the world's shipping lanes looking exactly like the neutral vessels they pretended to be. They were hunting ships, and the Indian Ocean was their preferred killing ground. The most successful was Penguin, officially designated Skiff 33 by the Kriegsmarine. Under the command of Captain Ernst Felix Kruder, Penguin entered the Indian Ocean in August 1940, having passed the Cape of Good Hope from the Atlantic. What followed was a campaign of destruction that no single surface raider of either world war would ever match. After sinking or capturing 31 ships totaling 136,000 tons worldwide, she was finally found and sunk by HMS Cornwall on May 8, 1941. Before she went down, she had also converted a captured Norwegian tanker into an auxiliary mine layer and deployed it to sow mines in the approaches to Sydney, Hobart, and ports across South Australia, threatening the very shipping lanes feeding Australia's war effort from half a world away. After putting up a valiant fight, a shell detonated her mines, causing a massive explosion that killed Kruder, 340 crewmen, and 214 prisoners. Before the Penguin's demise, the ship that served along with her in the Indian Ocean was Atlantis under Captain Bernhard Rogge. The Atlantis cruise lasted for 602 days. She sank or captured 22 ships totaling 145,968 tons. Atlantis would become one of the most famous commerce raiders in naval history, not merely for the tonnage she destroyed, but for an extraordinary intelligence coup. On November 11, 1940, she stopped and captured the British freighter Automedon. In her strong room, concealed behind locked steel doors, were 15 bags of top-secret mail intended for British Far East Command. Among those documents were Royal Navy fleet orders, gunnery instructions, and intelligence reports that were passed directly to the Japanese. The captured material gave Japan a detailed picture of British naval weakness in the Far East. Some have speculated that this information factored into the planning of the Pearl Harbor attack. 9 German auxiliary cruisers are believed to have sank 140 ships and captured more, accounting for over 830,000 tons, across 3769 cumulative days at sea. Their operational time spent in the Indian Ocean was most effective. Japan had entered the war in December 1941, escalating the nature of the threat in the Indian Ocean dramatically. And after the fall of Singapore, after the destruction of British naval forces in Malayan waters, after the annihilation of the ABDA command in the Java Sea, Japan turned west. What happened next is one of the most strategically significant and least discussed naval events of the entire war. In early April 1942, a little-known episode of World War II took place, said by Sir Winston Churchill to be the most dangerous moment of the war, when the Japanese made their only major offensive westward into the Indian Ocean. Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet, the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, sailed directly toward Ceylon, the key British naval base controlling access to the Indian Ocean. The island of Ceylon was strategically important since it commanded the Indian Ocean. Thus it controlled access to India, the vital Allied shipping routes to the Middle East, and the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. The British Eastern Fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir James Somerville, was forewarned by intelligence and managed to slip away before the Japanese arrived. But the cost was enormous. Nagumo sent in 91 bombers and 38 fighters. HMS Hermes, the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, was sunk. The cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire were caught at sea and destroyed in minutes by Japanese dive bombers. And simultaneously, a Japanese carrier task force under Admiral Ozawa went to work on merchant shipping in the Bay of Bengal. In 3 days, Ozawa's force managed to sink 23 merchant ships, 20 in a single day, totaling over 115,000 gross registered tons. While some exact numbers are unverified, it's speculated by some that possibly tens of thousands of tons of shipping were sunk by Japanese submarines off India's west coast. The result was catastrophic for British strategic posture. Somerville decided to send the 4 R-class battleships to Kenya to protect the vital shipping lanes off East Africa, while fleet carriers would base themselves in Bombay. This meant the Royal Navy was abdicating control of the eastern Indian Ocean to the Japanese. The supply routes to the Middle East, to India, to Australia, all of it was exposed. Historian Sir Arthur Bryant assessed the situation plainly. A Japanese naval victory in April 1942 would have given Japan total control of the Indian Ocean, isolated the Middle East, and cut the supply lines, sustaining the entire Allied war effort from North Africa to the Soviet Union. It didn't happen, but not because the Allies stopped it. The Japanese stopped themselves. Japanese intentions to mount a major offensive into the Indian Ocean were placed on hold in March 1942. Strong naval forces were needed in the Western Pacific against the United States, and the Imperial Japanese Army refused to allocate troops for an invasion of Ceylon. The decision to go east to Midway rather than west to Ceylon may have been the single most consequential strategic choice Japan made in the entire war. It saved the British position in the Indian Ocean. With the Japanese surface fleet pulling back after April 1942, the threat in the Indian Ocean didn't disappear. It mutated. Japanese submarines began an aggressive campaign against Allied convoy routes that has received almost no attention in Western historical literature. By June 1942, Japanese submarines in the region were focusing on the Mozambique Channel between continental Africa and Madagascar, sinking over 100,000 tons worth of shipping by mid-July 1942. The reason Madagascar matters is critical. The British had captured Vichy French Madagascar in May 1942 precisely to prevent Japan from using it as a submarine base. If Japanese submarines had operated freely from Madagascar's ports, every convoy route from South Africa to the Middle East and India would have been under direct attack. The occupation of Madagascar was an early Allied amphibious success of the war, and it was entirely motivated by the Indian Ocean convoy threat. That campaign is barely mentioned in standard histories. Japanese midget submarines had already struck in May 1942, torpedoing battleships and tankers off the coast of Madagascar. And I-27, the same Japanese submarine that would eventually be responsible for one of the worst maritime disasters of the entire war, was operating in the Indian Ocean, attacking shipping from the coast of Australia to the waters off India. Now comes a chapter of this story that is almost entirely unknown, and it is genuinely one of the stranger episodes of World War II. While the Royal Navy was fighting to hold the Indian Ocean against Japanese submarines, the Atlantic battle was simultaneously spilling into those same waters from the other direction. German U-boats were coming, not a few exploratory patrols. An entire operational group designated the Monsoon Group, after the May 1943 crisis in the Atlantic, in which the tactical and operational initiative passed from the U-boat arm to Allied warships and aircraft. The Germans decided to look for less strongly defended areas. The Indian Ocean was the only region that now offered almost peacetime shipping arrangements and was within U-boat operating radius. The plan was extraordinary. German Type 9 long-range U-boats would sail from their bases in occupied France, round the Cape of Good Hope, cross the entire Indian Ocean, and operate out of Japanese-controlled ports in Southeast Asia. The Type 9 U-boats departed from bases in occupied France and Norway, navigating treacherous routes around the Cape of Good Hope to reach Japanese-controlled ports in Southeast Asia. Over the course of operations from 1943 to 1945, a total of 41 U-boats were assigned to the Monsoon Group. The Indian Ocean was the only place where German and Japanese forces fought in the same theater. To avoid incidents between Germans and Japanese, attacks on other submarines were strictly forbidden. The transit itself was lethal. Of the initial 11 Monsoon boats, 4 were sunk on passage and another 2, of which one was sunk, were diverted on emergency refueling duties. Thus only 5 boats managed to break through. They were hunted by Allied aircraft and warships across the entire length of the South Atlantic before they even reached their operational area. The Monsoon Group began sinking ships within weeks of reaching the Indian Ocean. They worked the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the waters off East Africa. And because Allied anti-submarine forces had been built around the Atlantic threat, radar-equipped aircraft, destroyer escort groups, ultra-intelligence focused on North Atlantic U-boat coordinates, the Indian Ocean convoys were painfully vulnerable. Across all patrols, the Monsoon Group sank 33 Allied merchant vessels totaling 191,860 GRT, straining convoy protections and diverting resources to anti-submarine warfare in the Indian Ocean theater. That number sounds modest compared to Atlantic losses, but consider the strategic context. Every tanker sunk in the Gulf of Oman was fuel that wouldn't reach Allied forces in the Western Desert or the Soviet Union via the Persian corridor. Every freighter lost in the Arabian Sea was supplies that wouldn't reach the 8th Army, or the garrison in India, or the forces fighting in Burma. The Allies eventually hunted the Monsoon boats down. Ultra-intercepts guided British warships to the German supply tankers in the Indian Ocean. The Charlotte Schliemann was scuttled in February 1944 when HMS Relentless found her while she was refueling a U-boat. Without replenishment in these vast distances, the U-boats became stranded and vulnerable. One by one, they were destroyed. No account of the Indian Ocean Convoy War would be complete without confronting what happened on February 12, 1944. Convoy KR-8 was making the crossing from Mombasa, Kenya, to Colombo, Ceylon. It was a routine troop movement, the kind of voyage that had been made dozens of times on this route. On 5 February 1944, Khedive Ismail left Mombasa bound for Colombo carrying 1,324 passengers, including 996 members of the East African Artillery's 301st Field Regiment, 271 Royal Navy personnel, 19 Wrens, 53 nursing sisters and their matron, 9 members of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, and a war correspondent. The convoy was escorted by the heavy cruiser HMS Hawkins and 2 destroyers, HMS Paladin and HMS Petard. After a week at sea, the convoy reached the warm waters southwest of the Maldives. It was after lunch. Many passengers were watching an entertainment concert below decks. Others were sunbathing on deck in the clear tropical afternoon. At 14:30, the Japanese submarine I-27 had taken position off Khedive Ismail's port side to attack. The sub fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck the Khedive Ismail, 1 in the engine room, 1 in the boiler room. The troopship's stern was engulfed in flame and smoke, and she sank in 3 minutes, too quickly to launch a single lifeboat. Of 1,500 people aboard Khedive Ismail, only 208 men and 6 women survived the sinking and subsequent battle. 1,220 men and 77 women were killed. The sinking was among the worst Allied maritime shipping disasters of the Second World War, and the largest loss of servicewomen in the history of the Commonwealth of Nations. However, the sinking received very little publicity at the time because the huge loss of life was considered damaging to morale. That suppression, deliberate, official, wartime suppression, is part of why this theater has remained in the shadows for 80 years. What followed the sinking was a 2.5-hour battle in which the destroyers Petard and Paladin hunted I-27 through the waters thick with survivors. Depth charges were set to the shallowest possible depth, killing and wounding many of the very people in the water they were trying to protect. HMS Paladin attempted to ram the submarine, but I-27's hydroplane tore a 15-foot gash in the destroyer's hull. Finally, a 7th torpedo from HMS Petard blew I-27 in half. The submarine went down with all hands. By 1944 and into 1945, the Allied grip on the Indian Ocean had tightened considerably. The Eastern Fleet had been rebuilt, reinforced with modern carriers and cruisers. Ultra-intelligence was being applied to Indian Ocean U-boat traffic. The Monsoon Group was being systematically destroyed. Japanese submarines were increasingly being pulled back to defend the home islands, but the war in the Indian Ocean never entirely ended. On July 26, 1945, less than 3 weeks before Japan's surrender, the first Indian Ocean kamikaze strike sank HMS Vestal and damaged HMS Amir during Operation Livery. The Indian Ocean Convoy War ran for virtually the entire duration of World War II. From the first German commerce raider in 1939 to the last kamikaze strike in July 1945, 6 years of continuous naval warfare across a theater that most histories reduce to a footnote. So why doesn't anyone talk about it? Several reasons, and they all reinforce each other. First, the institutional memory of the war was written overwhelmingly from an American perspective, and America's primary naval engagement was the Pacific. The Indian Ocean was a British and Commonwealth theater. British losses, British convoys, British and East African troops dying in the water. The American publishing industry had little structural incentive to center that story. Second, the Atlantic narrative was already saturated. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the war, generated its own enormous body of literature, film, and memorialization. Wolf packs, depth charges, U-boat aces. The framework was established early and has dominated ever since. Third, the Indian Ocean theater produced no single battle of the Midway or Jutland scale that would anchor the popular imagination. It was a grinding war of attrition across vast distances, commerce raiding, convoy protection, submarine hunting. Precisely the kind of unglamorous, sustained logistics warfare that struggles to compete with carrier battles and island invasions for public attention. Fourth, wartime censorship deliberately suppressed some of the worst disasters, like the sinking of the Khedive Ismail. Other losses that were deemed too damaging to report accurately. When the war ended, those suppressions became the default historical record. Fifth, and perhaps most significantly, the Indian Ocean theater cut across the clean binary of Atlantic versus Pacific that has structured virtually all popular World War II history. It was a theater where German U-boats operated from Japanese bases, where British carriers fought alongside American ones, where African and Indian and East African troops formed the bulk of the forces being transported across the water. It resisted the simple national narratives that dominated post-war history writing. The stakes of this forgotten war deserve to be understood plainly. If the Japanese had followed up the April 1942 Indian Ocean raid, if they had invaded Ceylon, established a permanent naval presence in the Western Indian Ocean, the supply lines feeding the British Eighth Army in North Africa would have been severed. The Lend-Lease corridor to the Soviet Union via the Persian Gulf would have been cut. India itself would have been threatened from the sea. The entire strategic calculus of the Middle East campaign, and potentially the Eastern Front, would have shifted. Churchill was not exaggerating when he called it the most dangerous moment of the war. He understood that the loss of the Indian Ocean would have meant the loss of the war's logistical architecture. The ocean held. The convoys kept running. The supplies reached their destinations. Britain and the Commonwealth paid for that continuity in ships and lives across 6 years of fighting that has largely gone unrecognized. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and nurses died, and for the most part, history moved on without them.